to Fresh Take.
What it is, what it do. It is an absolute pleasure here on Fresh Take to have the director of Mr.Dressup, Rob McCallum. Just a wonderful, wonderful documentary about Mr. Dressup coming to Amazon on the 10th.
Oh, I'm so excited. I mean, I got to spend today talking about Mr. Dressup. I've spent the last several days speaking about Mr. Dressup. So I'm delighted to chat with you and hear your connection and talk about the film. October 10th already. Wow, global release on Prime. Here we go.
That's got to be super exciting for you. What's been the experiences for you? Like I could see just from your background, just the copious amount of pop culture that you got in that background. One of the better setups of anything I've got a chance to do in an interview. So what does it mean for you that you've got into, because this definitely speaks to, I think, a lot of people, my age, being born in the 80s, growing up with that. And you can see some of, again, the pop culture in the background of 80s, but in the background there is, what does it mean to you that you've been able to send this love letter to everybody else that grew up with him?
It means everything. It's the absolute world. I mean, I've spent the last 20 years doing pop culture documentaries. I've done stuff on Nintendo. I've, sold a documentary on He-Man to Netflix. It's just following my passion and sharing that passion with people. And you know what it's like, man, when you find somebody that loves the thing that you love, there's like that spark moment, right? We're like, you speak my same language, you get me. And with Mr. Dressup, it's all of Canada, man. Like everybody speaks Dressup, coast to coast to coast, and the only people that don't might be like 30 years or younger. And that's a weird thing, right? And I'm sure we'll maybe talk about that later, about why the timing of this dog
I was going to
works.
bring it up to you now because that was one of my most interesting questions on here. Because especially when you look at the puppets, right, and the growth of the puppets, right, and you have the main core leave there. You have Casey and Finnegan leave, but then you have the Crow and Granny and all them come. And I vaguely, being born in '85, vaguely remember Casey and Finnegan, but Granny and the Crow and everybody else I more identify with from my generation. So it's interesting kind of hear what you've heard so far about the different generations of how they've grown on, and specifically with the puppets. Like, and I'm sure you've had a few people be like, oh, I kind of vaguely remember Casey Finnegan, but like Granny was like my puppet.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see who gravitates towards what era of Dressup. When we started this, we were a lean, mean machine of three that were doing this. We have my co-collaborator, co-conspirator, Jordan Morris, who grew up with Dressup in the early 70s, bow tie, suspenders, overalls, wacky shirt. I grew up in the 80s, very much squarely in the Casey and Finnegan, but never really stopped watching. So I was very much Truffles and Chester the Crow and Annie and Granny as well. And then we had Dave, who was our camera op, and he was all Dressup 2.0. He didn't know Casey and Finnegan at all. So even between the three of us, we had kind of three distinct periods of Mr. Dressup. And bringing that into every interview and the people that we were talking to was just, it was a very cool rounding experience that we weren't just like looking at one slice of this pop culture, which, I mean, admittedly, when you do pop culture documentaries, it's so easy to go down that tunnel of here's the thing that I know. So I'm going to put all my attention on this and kind of block out anything else that feels weird to me. With Dressup, we got to cover it all. And it's been really surreal connecting to people who are like, oh, I really love Aunt Bird and Miss Biz and Hester the Witch. And like a lot of people listening that are Dressup fans are like, who are these people? I'm like, well, they were puppets with Casey and Finnegan, also performed by Judith Lawrence. There's also Alligator Al, like
Alligator Al, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of different characters and trends and ebbs and flows, but the show evolved and changed a little bit and had different flavors with it. And, every good show should.
And I thought it was so poignant of you in the documentary to point out of Sesame Street coming along, and if it would, hit into that. And I thought the really important thing, and I can't remember who said it, but hitting like kids don't know, like, yeah, they can see Elmo and Kermit and their mouse moving and then be animated. But at the end of the day, they're just there to be entertained and to learn and to be engaged. And there was this world that Mr. Dresser brought you into, and Sesame Street did, that, you were children, you were engaged no matter what the puppet was doing and how animated or animated they weren't.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Ernie says, Finnegan's mouth moved, Casey's didn't, but it didn't matter much to the kids. And I think that's a testament to Judith Lawrence, right? Her ability to perform those characters and still give them a very convincing connection to everybody that's watching at home. You know, it's pretty remarkable that you can take a like plaster Paris kind of like puppet, a wooden puppet, if you would, of Casey that has zero facial expression changing whatsoever. But yet you feel when that puppet is sad, when that puppet is frustrated, when that puppet is angry, because there's so much body language, the intonation of the voice. It's a kudos to Judith that she's able to take that Punch and Judy style approach, compete with the Muppets.
Mm-hmm. That's no easy task to do. And you talked about the generation thing. I know you don't cover this as much in the documentary, but what do you think about the current gen of children's television now? I'm not a father myself, but I'm an uncle, so I've had to go and watch the Coco Melons and all that kind of stuff, and there doesn't really seem to be that space anymore. I guess the closest for entertaining and kind of teaching kids would be a Bluey. But there definitely is a hole that like a Mr. Dressup or Mr. Rogers isn't there anymore.
Yeah, I mean that format seemed to go away in the mid to late 90s, right? That
Yeah.
adult, usually male host talking direct to camera with some puppet friends. And that's when animation really started to come in, where we really
Mm-hmm.
started to see the breakthrough computerized tools. I mean, you even see it like in print, right? In video games, we're going to polygons now. Even box art on video games goes from illustrative oil paintings to logos. You know, we used to have like this awesome artwork for Atari and NES games, and now we're just getting a Quake logo or a Doom logo. Like
Dude with the
there's
gun
a
with a
real
shadow.
yeah, we're getting bare minimum stuff, and it works to a different degree, but I think kids need grounding in reality, and I think that's why Dress Up works. And I will point into contrast that, there are real shows out there, but they don't ground it in reality. Look at something like Blippy,
Yeah.
right? Now here's Blippy, who is an over the top guy in bright clothes. That's not real. Nobody acts like that for real. He's got a voice, it's a fake put on. It's almost insulting to the kids when you think about it. Now, the one redeeming feature I do appreciate about a show like Blippi is it's shot predominantly with one take, and there's very little that's sped up, so kids get to spend actual time with that character, which I think is valuable. And that's what Dress Up did as well. We got to spend time with Dress Up. We got to see every single scissor cut, every single drawing stroke on the pad. We got to see him put on every piece of his costume, and that time spent is very important because nobody is teaching kids today process, and nobody's teaching them patience and the power of silence and just doing it. Like, you'd never be able to pitch a show that champions boredom, because that's what that is to kids today. If there's not something flashing in their face to say I'm bored, it's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need these distractions all the time. Learn to sit and be with yourself, because when you do that, that's when this turns on. And then you'll never be bored if you know how to make this work. And that's what Dress Up taught us.
That it's so precise there because I was watching actually just a live action thing with my nephew this week, who's about 4 or 5, and it took about 5 minutes, but they were bored because again they're just so engaged now with the animation side of things that art isn't really there for them to learn. They need to have that Coco Melon that's nonstop in your mind over and over again to teach them lessons instead of having what you had there. And that they kind of changed the subject too. That CBC kids slot too. I thought you guys did a really good job of connecting that. And how many people have told you, and I'm sure that you've been asked this question a million times, but the Mr. Rogers coming up and starting in Canada, I had no idea. And I don't think a lot of people had any idea the connection that Mr. Rogers had that initially led to Mr. Dressup. Because I mean, for a lot of kids growing up in Canada, it was like, oh, it's Big Friendly Giant, Mr. Rogers, and that, but didn't know that he like got his whole start out here.
Yeah, and it's a pretty important detail. It was something that I was aware of, but not to the depth that we obviously get to explore in the film. And remember, there was a Mr. Rogers documentary that came out, in 2018 by Morgan
Yeah,
Neville, I'm pretty sure. And they started in like 1967. So they completely gloss over anything before 67
exactly. Yeah,
for the most part. They don't talk about his years in Toronto where he created his show essentially and
yep.
developed his technique and was on camera for the first time, or the people that he collaborated with and like one of his best friends, which seems like a glaring omission when you're trying to make a film about Mr. Rogers that critiques whether his approach to children's education was impactful or not. And remember, that's the core thesis of that film. Did his approach to children work? It's not a biopic, it's not a chronology. It's an examination of, does that method work? But how can you do that if you don't know the person and who he surrounds himself with and how he developed that technique in the first place? So believe me, I'm happy they didn't do that. so that we could do it justice
Absolutely.
and put Canada firm in the spotlight of saying, without us, there would be no Mr. Rogers to that degree. Because he was ready. He had graduated seminary school, and 3 days later is when he got the call to come up from Frederick Rainsbury to develop a show. So he was going to be off doing something else. And he was a
Wow.
well-off American. He didn't need to do anything. His family was quite wealthy and independent. This was something he chose to do, and Toronto and Canada offered him that opportunity. Nowhere else.
And I thought the one thing you did really good as a filmmaker, people will talk about that at the start of the film, like, oh, that's really interesting. You left that narrative throughout the film to the point where even when he retired, and still the bond of that relationship and how much Fred Rogers still connected to him throughout the career. This wasn't just a guy helping him out, giving him a start. It was a friendship that budded all the way to the end of their lives. And I thought you did a really poignant job of talking about that throughout the film.
For me, we wanted to ground it in Ernie's relationships. Like you'll see on the surface, it's very much, what happens in front of the camera, like on the
Yeah.
show, and what's happening behind the scenes with Ernie as a person. But within that, I wanted to ground Ernie's trajectory in his relationships with people. First with Fred Rogers, and then his wife, and with Judith, because these are the most important relationships in his life. And in two, maybe a bit of a lesser extent, Jim Parker, who is his traveling tour mate and his best friend, as well as a result. But those are the key relationships. And who are we if we're not defined by the company we keep? Those are the people that are always with us through good times and bad times. And that's what anchors the entire structure of the film. So we had to come back to Fred Rogers. We had to keep revisiting that because that's the reality of that friendship. They never stopped being in touch. And that letter that you mentioned, we don't shine a big spotlight on it, but the reality is Ernie wrote that letter to Fred Rogers 2 months to the day before his death.
Wow.
From his cottage in Maine, and sent it to Fred. And even still at the age of like 71, he was telling Fred how much he meant to him, how much their friendship impacted them, and how thankful he was.
What was the thesis? What was the nugget, the kernel that made you be like, you talked about all the past work that you've done. What made you want to come and tell the story? Because obviously everyone loves Mr. Dressup, and I think it was not told any better than the story his son told on 9/11 times, trying to get to his father and how much he meant, and that airline attendant helping him get home because of how much Mr. Dressup meant. But what was it for you that like, yeah, this is the story that we need to tell because Canadians want to hear it?
It's the ultimate underdog story for me. When you look at the ingredients on the page of this show, it should not have worked for a million different reasons. Okay. It's shot live to tape. There's no stopping. Once an episode starts, they continue filming all the way through like a play. They have no budget. They have people that aren't Canadian leading this Canadian driven show. They are constantly fighting for time and every possible resource. And yet, despite everything that happens externally and personally, they manage to persevere and find a way. It's that spirit of resolve, right? They will not be pushed away. They will not be stopped. They will not be shut down. And I think more than ever, we need that kind of underdog spirit, that independent spirit to help champion where we are today. It's so easy to feel defeated anytime you look at any kind of news source. The world is a heavy place, especially for kids. So something like Mr. Dressup and that underdog, resilience and resourcefulness spirit that the show preaches, I think is needed now more than ever. And that's what I want to get out there. That's that feeling of hope. There's hope out there. Just keep at it. See what you got around yourself, see who's in your corner, and you'll get through.
And that show had a big impact of it. And I think you got it from what a set of star-studded people you had to have come and talk to. You had Michael J. Fox, you had Kids in the Hall, you had Andrew Fung. Where did that come from of reaching out to impactful Canadians and their thoughts on Mr. Dressup?
Well, honestly, they just kept hounding us. It's like Michael J. Fox kept calling me in the middle of the night, like, "Hey, I really want to be in your film." I'm like, Michael, I'm trying to get some sleep. Just okay, I get it. You were on Family Ties. You were in Back to the Future. Yeah, I know who you are. Same with Bare Naked Ladies. They were writing songs for me. Just like slow down, guys. I get it. You're talented. That never happened. None of that happened.
We're going to
We hired
pretend
a
it did.
casting agent. I mean, we hired a casting agent. We had some connections to these people, of course, but we hired a casting agent. We did it all by the book. And I'll tell you, we went to a ton of Canadians and nobody said no.
I
Like
don't
not a
even know
single
what.
person said no. I mean, if they don't appear in the film, it's because there was a scheduling issue. And that is what it is. There's no hard feelings about any of that. But nobody ever said no. So we made it work. Anytime somebody said yes, we found a way to make that work within, you know, what we were capable of producing. And it was just cool to sit down and talk about Mr. Dressup. Yes, Michael J. Fox starred in the Back to the Future trilogy, and he's been in some awesome TV shows. When talking about Dressup, it like that stuff doesn't even matter, right?
Mhm.
It's just you're speaking the same language, and Dressup is that language that connects us.
Yeah, I think, and I know you're short on time, so I'll ask this final question. I think the one thing you really hit, and again, it kind of goes back to that airport scene, which really stuck out to me of how important he was. But when you mention Canadians, and obviously as Canadians, we're so proud of anyone that's a celebrity from us, right? Like we'll always be like, "Oh, that's Canadian, that's Canadian," and him not technically being an initial Canadian and getting his Canadian citizenship and how important that was, but you know, even just getting ready to do this interview, and I mentioned I'm talking to the director of the Mr. Dressup documentary, and the light up in voices and faces that I get, I think he is as popular as a Canadian as Wayne Gretzky or Bret Hart or David Suzuki.
Here's a story for you. There was some sort of CBC signing thing that had a bunch of influential Canadians. Wayne Gretzky was there.
Yeah.
Gordie Howe was there. It was a bunch of other people. And guess who had the longest lineup? Even with Wayne Gretzky in attendance, Mr. Dressup's lineup, young and old,
Wild.
stretched for blocks. If that doesn't tell you something, and if that doesn't tell you about who people want to surround themselves by, I don't know what will. I really don't. He's proud to be a Canadian. He chose to be a Canadian. He's kind of like our best secret. Canadians aren't necessarily great at celebrating themselves. You know, Americans are really good at celebrating everything. And I'm a dual citizen now as well, Canadian born, American later, choose to call Canada home. So much like Ernie Coombs to a degree. But Canadians are not good at celebrating themselves. But you know what? Canadians know when they have something cool as well. And they hang on to it for themselves. They don't kind of want to share it because they know how special it is. And I think they don't want necessarily anything on the outside to tarnish it. But I think it's time to allow this thing known as Mr. Dressup, this show and these people to get out into the world, and having it happen on October 10th on Prime globally. It's going to hit a lot of people near and far. And I think a lot of people in other countries are going to say, hey, I had a kids show like that too. We had our own Mr. Dressup. And man, I remember those times. And how come our world isn't like that anymore? And if we can make those kind of comments and questions appear in people's head and start that discussion, then Dressup is still working today.
Rob, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. I know you got a busy day. An absolutely lovely documentary and a love letter to Mr. Dressup, and everyone will, I'm sure, enjoy it as much as I did and much as I enjoyed talking to you. You can again find it on Amazon globally on October 10th. Rob, thanks so much for your time. Cheers and enjoy the day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Fresh Take Network. Follow us on social media platforms at Fresh Take 42.